Good afternoon and welcome everyone, also everyone online. Welcome to this seminar as part of our public law seminar series. My name is Myriam Hunter-Henin. I'm a professor of comparative law and religion here at UCL. And I will be chairing the discussions today. Our speaker is Dr. Patrick O'Brien. Patrick, you are currently a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University, but you used to be at UCL and also, I think, at LSE. And since your doctorate at St. John's College at Oxford on judicial review and democracy, Patrick has published extensively on courts, which is the topic of our seminar. As discussants, we have two UCL colleagues, Professor Erin Delaney, Professor of Comparative Constitutional Law here, and also, naturally, our beloved Centre Director, and Dr. Soto Tamayo, also from UCL's Global Centre for Democratic Constitutionalism. So, Patrick, I will give you the floor on trust, judicial independence, and judicial power.
Thank you, Myriam, for the lovely introduction, and Erin for the invitation. I have a PowerPoint. I'm not sure how much I'm going to stick to it. Apologies. But I will try and use it to keep me on track as much as I can. If I can think about, give a little bit about where this idea comes from. I was once upon a time at UCL at the Constitution Unit and working on a project on judicial independence in the light of the changes that were brought in by the Constitutional Reform Act 2005. And as part of that, we had a series of seminars where we'd invite the great and the good and people, politicians and judges and subservients who were involved with all those changes and the things that happened subsequent to those changes. And I just vividly remember at one of those seminars, someone who had been formerly a really senior civil servant in what had been the Lord Chancellor's department, saying to me, you see, the thing is, I mean, he wouldn't have done it in my accent, but imagine a very, very nice, but a very establishment English accent. The thing is, it just can't be like that anymore, Patrick, but I'm sad that it can't be like that anymore, referring to all of the appurtenances and the glory and the gowns and all of that connected with the judiciary. And that's a thought that's kind of stayed with me over really more than a decade. Why is it that it can't be like that anymore? And there are all sorts of good reasons why it can't be like that anymore. But the sort of the initial thought behind that and behind the paper and behind the idea is that kind of we have had this transition. We don't entirely know why we've had this transition, and we don't really know the effects of it. So what I'm going to do to try and situate this is take the topic du jour, and I'm going to say that to some extent, I want to address the problem of populism. I want to address what I might call elite distrust and conspiracy theories. I'm not going to grapple directly with those today, but I'm just going to say that potentially they are an issue. So when we talk about judicial power, when we see people who in past generations would not have been criticizing judges by name, would not have been identifying them as, what's that, pro-migrant bias, as woke, as activists, as enemies of the people, that on some level that this may be a problem of trust and distrust. Conspiracy theories also, free men on the land, all of that, judges are all corrupt, and those are also problems of trust or distrust. And that's where I'm situating. That's what I'm suggesting, that perhaps that some of this, not all of it, we can see that there are much wider patterns happening in society to do with the internet, to do with the flow of information that support these changes, but that some of them are also due to the fact that patterns of trust in judges particularly have been disrupted in the past 30 years. We have obviously significantly more accountability, more openness. We have more distance from politicians in particular. We have what Max Weber would have called more disenchantment. So disenchantment being the idea that as societies, once we get to a certain point, we become bureaucratic, we become industrialized, We transition from magic and mysticism as the explanation for the authority of the monarch or the state, and we go for something smaller, less emotionally satisfying, but more rationally satisfying. We now present judges essentially as regulated, bureaucratic professionals located within a management hierarchy. There is obviously less power for individual judges as part of that. I will hopefully get on talking about that in a little bit. But I want to suggest that trust might not be exclusively a rational thing, and that when we change all of the architecture to do with regulating judges, as we have done, that maybe we're ignoring the non-rational parts of trust. We're ignoring the aesthetic, we're ignoring story, we're ignoring symbolism. So I suppose I have to start by saying, answering the question, what is trust? If you look at sort of social theory on this, the simplest possible explanation is that it's an expectation or an attitude in which A relies on B to do C. And in the paper, I call this simple trust. So when we rely on things, you know, if you look at someone like Nicholas Luhmann, he's talking about relying on the earth turning and the tides moving and all that, obviously much broader than we want to go here. But essentially, when we rely on something or someone, we're trusting them. Why do we rely on them then? What are the sources of trust? Well, we can break this down into three rough different aspects. We have cognitive trust, where we use our rationality, we use empirical evidence to decide that this person is trustworthy, that we can rely upon them. But we also have dispositional and cultural sources of trust. Dispositional are to do with the person. You know, if I am a distrusting person, if I have a negative outlook on the world, I am less likely to trust than someone who doesn't have those characteristics. We also know from empirical research that people's attitude of trust towards the state, towards politicians, tracks significantly their economic well-being, their level of education. So a lot of the components of trust are not actually connected to the way that judges are regulated or presented. We also have significant cultural variances in trust. Just again, as a sort of a vignette, a lot of Nordic countries record significantly higher social trust than Southern European countries. And there have been all sorts of explanations advanced for this. One of the key ones is the difference in historical religious patterns, actually, that there's a more kind of collaborative mode of Christianity working in Northern Europe than the Catholicism of Southern Europe. But it's sufficient for now to say that we have all these different sources of trust. Now, I want to locate trust within judicial independence. I don't want to spend too much time on this because this may be taking us slightly off track, depending on what we want to talk about. But I'm going to suggest that judicial independence is really about protecting judges' impartiality. I hope that's not controversial, but it's not the same thing as their impartiality. The way that we tend to use judicial independence is to describe the set of rules and cultures and structures that are around judges. But I want to say that those are about protecting the impartiality of the judge, which is the core thing that we're worried about. And impartiality is actually, it's an attitude, it's a psychology, it's a property of the individual judge. We can't measure it really. It's you know, there will sometimes be flagrant examples of actual bias in a judge, but most of the time we can't measure it. So what we do is we focus on independence, we focus on the set of rules, we focus on the empirical evidence around judges to show that they are trustworthy, they should be trusted. So my argument or my premise here is that simple trust creates a basis for the reliance in judges that I described. So we have independence as the evidence that we can rely on judges to be impartial. Simple as that, I hope. We then need to think about two variants of judicial independence, two ways of regulating judges, two ways of surrounding judges with protection so that they are impartial. Now, the old version of judicial independence was done significantly by tradition, as a great writer on this work, Robert Stevens, puts it. It's all about culture and status, it's salary, it's knighthoods in this country, it's peerages. The basis of trust is significantly cultural. It's cognitive as well, in the sense that it's empirical. We believe that someone who's coming from that kind of elite position socially, but also by training, will be someone who is reliable, dependable. They are good chaps in that great phrase of UK constitutional discourse. But it's also cultural. We are placing judges within this position, this particular social position, this traditional historical place, where they just fill this hole that we have traditionally trusted. So it's cognitive and it's cultural in the terms I used earlier. The new judicial independence then is a very different proposition. It's highly regulated, it's highly rule bound, and it's got this managerial bureaucratic aspect to it. There, the basis for reliance is the rules. We are effectively placing our trust in the regulatory system as a basis for reassuring us that the judge is going to be reliable. We are overwhelmingly within the cognitive space as a source for trust. Now, we've had this change from old to new in actually lots of different societies, but in the UK, the pivot point is around the Human Rights Act 1998 and the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, the significant new Labour constitutional renovation that happened around that time. And we tell ourselves a story in constitutional theory and on undergraduate public law courses that this is all about the separation of powers. We are locating this change, we are locating the Constitutional Reform Act within a narrative that says that UK constitutional arrangements were outdated, which of course they were. They didn't bear comparison with other countries, which of course was also correct. And so on this basis, things like the role of the Lord Chancellor, the position of the Supreme Court within the House of Lords, the wider sense of appointments and discipline being informal and significantly done by politicians. These all failed to meet an internationally set. And at the same time, international human rights law and international best practices coming out with reams and reams of material, international documents on what a judge in a court system, what these things are supposed to look like. This essentially applies a separation of powers logic to a more detailed setting. So it's rules specifying the separation of powers, but for judges in courts. And we have specific ECHR cases, Venable and Thompson and McGonnell being prominent amongst these, that say that actually, no, the arrangements in the UK are not acceptable. They involve politicians and things that politicians shouldn't be involved in. And that's fair enough, and that's valid in its own terms. But what I want to suggest is that from the perspective that I'm taking this problem today, pardon me, and in trying to explain or create a historiography of this transition that happened in 2005 in particular, we're missing a lot of the story in constitutional theory, because at the same time or earlier, the role of professionals in society, in UK society, but in other liberal democratic societies, was changing really, really dramatically. Professionalism in general was becoming far more regulated. So if we take professionalism as a mode of work in which those doing the work have significant control over it, it's one that we can contrast with, firstly, sort of a capitalist consumerist model in which we are responding to controls that are located within money flows or within consumer demand, or then separately within bureaucracy and managerialism, where we're responding to hierarchies and rules. Professionalism is what Elliot Friedson describes as a sort of a third mode of control, in which effectively the professionals control their own work, they set up their own ethics systems. As an ideology, this is sort of a commitment to doing good work in the interest of society. This is obviously the best case for professionals, and there's all sorts of critiques we can make of this model. And at all times, we're going to have a different balance between all of these. But let's just roll with that for now. We get the role of professionals in society in the early 20th century, they're quite central. We get this Max Weber idea of the transition, the demystification of the state and authority. Professionals are central to that as experts. The state repositions itself as something that's based on rationality. And professionals have, importantly, cognitive authority. They are unchallenged experts within their space. This also gives them a weird sort of power, because if you are able to say to your manager, I'm sorry, I'm a member of the bar, or I'm a member of the General Medical Council, whatever it may be, I can't do this, because if I do this, I'm going to be disbarred, or I'm going to be deregistered as a doctor. That's a really important power, to be able to say no to your manager, to whoever's telling you what to do. So there's a professional autonomy power thing about maintaining ethics. Oops, something happened there. That's okay. So if we look at judges through this prism, judges are effectively a profession. Obviously, they are all members of the legal profession, but we can also define them as a profession in their own right. They regulate themselves through the common law and more informally and through orders. We see landmarks of professionalism. The creation of the House of Lords, indeed, originally in the 19th century, is about professionalization. Appeals heard by the House of Lords are going to be heard by professional judges. Bradlaugh and Clark in 1883 is the first example of lay judges being ignored in the disposal of appeals that went to the House of Lords. The Lord Chancellor just refused to count lay hands that went up in the disposal of that case. So judges were self-regulating. Judicial independence, I want to say, is the core professional ethic of being a judge. The idea that you maintain impartiality, detachment from yourself, detachment from the parties. And there's a strong focus within this on the judge as an individual and their independence of the judge as an individual. We then see from the 1970s onwards a wider narrative of deprofessionalization, not just amongst lawyers, but every profession goes through this. And there's all sorts of reasons for this. And the reasons are quite fun. You can go as far as you want with this, really. I don't want to labor it. Population growth is obviously a really significant one. We're dealing with much larger populations, which means much larger professional bodies. There's a lot of scandal. You know, there's all sorts of ways in which professionals misbehaved. You can name any particular account of doctors who went rogue and killed patients, all that kind of stuff. So there were genuine reasons why this model and its dominance came to be regarded as problematic. There's also more ideological reasons. The regulatory state grows. We can blame Thatcher. I think we can blame Thatcher. Neoliberalism, people are rejecting the social democratic state post World War II. In light of this, professionalism comes to be seen as elitist, as monopolistic, as anti-capitalist, as anti-consumer. The interests of the consumer become central. There's also a cultural preference for different forms of control. Managerialism, institutionalism. We also lose, or the professions lose, their cognitive authority. Firstly, through the idea that everyone should go to university, and secondly, through the internet. Everyone can be their own professional. Why do we have experts? We've had enough of experts, as Michael Gove famously put it. So we get a new form of regulated professionalism. This has been characterized by Michael Parr as the audit explosion, where we get a practical focus on acting replaced on effectively monitoring and verification. Simple trust goes away or is de-emphasized. Regulated trust becomes more important. The emphasis is on we trust this person, we trust this profession, we trust this institution because of the regulatory systems that are applied to it. So this again is focusing very heavily on cognitive empirical sources of trust. The new professionalism starts to look like this. Major characteristics: it's less collegiate and horizontal. Professionals tend to be more hierarchical and managerial. If you're a professional working now, you are typically located within some kind of hierarchy. So barristers are in larger chambers, solicitors are in solicitors firms, doctors are in hospitals, and academics are in very, very bureaucratized universities. We are less reliant, secondly, on informal social controls. The idea that something might just be not the done thing, that we have good people involved, is replaced with the idea that there should be formal rules, there should be external oversight, there should be independent agencies, we should have regulators to regulate the regulators. This regulatory idea becomes central. We also see kind of consumer adaptation, best practice, continuous assessment, continuous, what's the phrase called? Professional development. And so we get this characteristic that from sort of flat horizontal collegiate professions to hierarchical ones. And if we apply this to judges, we can see that is effectively what was done in 2005. We created judicial hierarchy. The Lord Chief Justice has been reimagined as basically the CEO of the judiciary, with senior managers in effectively Court of Appeal judges who have significant roles, sort of departmental roles. And we have judicial independence as a product or an attribute of the corporate judiciary rather than the individual judge. So this is very much locating or very much resembles what's happened to every other professional. And if we look at this from a power perspective, this means that the individual judge obviously has less power than, well, firstly than his or her senior managerial judges, but also less power by him or herself. The judges are now part of the kind of a continual management structure. They're required to do continuous training. None of this, of course, is a bad thing by itself, but they're deprived of this independent way of saying, well, no, I'm sorry, my ethics independence prevents me from doing this in the professional sense. Now, I want to think about finally why this might be problematic. And I don't want to say that all of this is problematic because that's going to take things too far. I did a road test of this talk with my 13-year-old son last night, and he came away and he said, like, Dad, this is a bit Tory. And that wasn't the intent, and it isn't the intent. A lot of this is inevitable. But what has happened? And the new professionalism tries to replace simple trust in individuals, as occupants of an office, with regulated trust. Honor O'Neill describes this memorably as an attempt to achieve something impossible: perfect administrative control. And it hasn't really worked, in the sense that I don't think we can say that trust in professions has improved over the last 50 years. If you think of professions that have been subjected to this new management structure, are politicians more trusted? I don't think so. They're definitely more regulated, but they're not more trusted. Estate agents, I don't think that's correct. Solicitors, I don't think so. So I don't think it's doing what it's meant to do in that sense. How might it damage trust? Well, this is where we get into the territory of me making a hunch and you having to listen to me. So sorry about that. But this is the hunch, and it needs more work and it needs more evidence. But nonetheless, here we go. So my hunch is that when it comes to trust, we need to think more about the role of disposition and culture as sources and drivers of trust, as reasons why we rely on judges. My guess, my thought on this is that most of the time we trust judges because they're judges. Not because of the regulatory structure, but because they occupy this culturally significant role. They have a historical role in society. To be a judge is to be something quite special. And we know this intuitively as lawyers. What do we associate with the law? What do lay people associate with the law? They associate imposing courtrooms, gowns, wigs, speaking in a particular style, references to the majesty of the law, which I think probably feel a bit outdated at this stage. But nonetheless, that is the cultural register. If you speak to judges, they always complain of judges never, we're not old and fusty like that. It's not like on Judge John Dee. Judges seem to be obsessed with Judge John Dee for some reason. But that is the association. So the first risk, I think, is that by taking this approach, by making judges feel like ordinary bureaucratic officials, by downplaying the historic, the traditional, the aesthetic, we are dampening down this cultural form of trust. We are removing them from this little hole that everyone has in their head that is judge-shaped, and we're saying they don't really fit that anymore. I do wonder, and this is completely speculation, if this is particularly a reason why conservatives find it more easy to criticize judges now, because these things are essentially part of a conservative aesthetic of authority. And if you take that away, it makes judges seem less historic, less traditional. But that is, again, me speculating quite a lot. The second risk is that all of these things just end up fueling distrust as a slightly different point. We are just generating reasons for people to distrust judges by making, by reducing the cognitive authority of judges, reducing their power to say what it is to be a judge, to say what judicial independence is, by removing judges in particular from politicians, by making them more distant from governing elites, and by having a regulated form of misconduct hearing and stuff like that. We are just generating evidence for those who are predisposed to distrust that actually, yeah, there is a lot to distrust. Judges misbehave all the time. They send tweets that go wrong, and they post on Facebook groups they shouldn't have posted on. They are not fit to be judges. And if you are predisposed to distrust judges, and the judicial system keeps telling you that you're right to do that, then what conclusion are you going to get to? The third risk then is the one that I adverted to earlier, which is that if we are deprofessionalizing judges in this sense, we are sort of removing from them the power to say no to superiors. We're removing this external power that professionalism as an ethic has, because we are saying that your superiors, the judicial training system, defines what it is to be a judge, and you have to hit the mark with that. So it gives them less power. They're less equipped to stand aside from the hierarchy in the limited circumstances where that might be appropriate. And I want to suggest very gently that circumstances of authoritarian populism might be that kind of situation. Okay, so a conclusion. There isn't a pathway back from this, I don't think. Again, my point is not to address my son's critique that this is very Tory. A lot of the drivers for this have to do with population growth. They have to do with professions themselves getting bigger. There are certain ways of running things that just have to be dealt with. But my concern is that the way that we have brought in these changes, not just in the UK, but more broadly afield, we haven't given a clear chance to, we haven't given clear consideration to what trust is and how to sustain it in this new, different environment. And I think looking ahead at the darker skies that we now see in politics, we have left them vulnerable, left judges vulnerable to populist authoritarianism because we have deprived them of this power that professionalism gives them to say no in certain limited circumstances. Okay, I did in the end take you through the whole thing. I hope that's okay. Thank you very much for having me.
Perfect timing.
Okay. Great.
So thank you for this sociological reflection. And so we have our expert sociologist, Lewis. For 10 minutes.
Thank you, Patrick, for this interesting presentation. I really appreciate that this project, this book project, put the cultural trust as the main explanatory variable of that is offering actually a new element in a contemporary debate of democracy. I think that this is something that it's been forgotten by many scholars, and I completely agree that this is like a trend. Like social scholars tend to omit these concepts of trust or professionalization culture and their impact in judicial legitimacy and democratic backsliding, for instance. The way I understand your main argument is that the shift or the transition from judicial independence that is old, that is more based on culture, to the new type of judicial independence that is more regulated, will have an impact on diminishing the trust on people, and this lack of trust in judges will therefore be utilized by populist leaders and take advantage on the situation, right? So, okay, based on this framework, I just want to make a series of general comments that might be contribute to consolidating more this project. And the first comment is to have a set of scope conditions. What do I mean with this? It's more about talking, being explicit whether you are building theory on how to explain vulnerability of judges, or if you are just creating a narrative of the UK case. Why I'm saying this is because as an outsider, as a people that is not familiarized with the UK legal system, it's really hard to follow or to buy many of the arguments and assumptions that I outlined there. And if the purpose of the project is to build theory, then you have to admit that the story that the shifts from cultural judicial independence to regulated judicial independence, it's highly context dependent. And for example, if you think in other type of developing democracies, they didn't even get to the point that they managed to create cultural judicial independence. So they don't have this background to transition from cultural to regulated judicial independence. I think that judges were instead of having this culture, they were more like subordinates of the executive rather than figures of authority. And therefore they were just compliers. Well, this is what I mean with the context of the scope conditions, like what are like the reach of your argument. The second one would be like that you must anticipate in providing like alternative explanations on what creates or diminishes trust. And there are like several like hypotheses out there that, for instance, transparency, like more transparency can actually increase trust. Also, like that the decline in trust could be driven by the media polarization rather than internal judicial reforms, or that bureaucratization can enhance judicial legitimacy in systems with historically opaque judiciaries. So therefore, like, you are actually bringing a system or a structure that is actually creating more transparency, rather, like, that is better than nothing. Or that this is also like driven by strategically by politicians, that in this shift that now with the constitutional adjudication in courts, judges became more like a political actor that can actually hinder or like put a stop to the politician's agenda. So therefore they are like the new enemy, and therefore like politicians will strategically attack the judges. So there are many ways in which you can explain why like trust can be driven other than the theory of the lack of from the shift of like the old to the new judicial independence that must be accounted. I mean, like, this doesn't mean that they are better or worse. It's just like recognizing like other like possible explanations. And okay, well, another comment would be that there are specific things in the concept and definitions that need more like specificity. For instance, your whole theory relies on this concept and definition of like simple trust that is actually useful, but is not sufficient. And with this, I mean, like, this approach is very conditional, like A relies on B to do C, and that's it. You know, like, it's useful to understand what is the problem, but it's not sufficient to understand like what like are like the other features around trust. And this is a recommendation that the manuscript needs to move away from intuitive examples that are laid out there, and instead adopt more like formal definitions to establish more like operational boundaries. And this is like also providing a few examples of how can you measure or how can you observe trust in the real world. For instance, this is like behavioral indicators. Is it like public opinion data? Is it like foreign direct investments? Or like it could be many things that can signal trust. So that they have to be acknowledged as part of like an overarching definition. And also like the manuscript like oscillates between like many other definitions of trust that I personally found it like a bit confusing, that we were talking about like cultural, traditional, psychological, rational. Like there is like a lot of definitions out there that, I mean, it's good to develop the theory, but they should be like, you know, probably summarized in a typology, like in a table with how they interact with each other. And also there is something that needs to be clarified, which is like at the very beginning of the manuscript is saying that this theory is more like a complementary approach on how trust and impacts on judicial independence. But in the rest of the paragraphs, it's more like laying out like this setting of antagonizing accounts, that they cannot like coexist, that instead they are like replacing each other, whether you are in this binary world of like cultural judicial independence or regulated judicial independence. And this is something that needs to, you know, follow at least some sort of consistency. And in terms of theory, I'll be like quicker. I have like many. Okay, then it should speak. Well, this is to develop more like a theory-based account on how cultural trust facilitates judicial independence, and why this erosion debilitates or weakens like judges, but vis-a-vis with other actors, because like this is just trying to contrast like why this has an impact on judges compared to other political actors or other key relevant actors, such as like legislators or like other bureaucrats or other type of bureaucrats that are not like traditional professionals as lawyers or medical doctors. Right, and this is also like a call to put the argument and the puzzle in perhaps framed in more like a agnostic way, in which this is instead like a universal theory that will happen. This is more like saying that the rule-based model may erode trust or not, depending like how sensitive are like judges to this type of vulnerabilities. And well, I can also follow with a few of these, but I'd rather just go to the next one, which is like the empirical support for your argument. And on this ground, there are two things that you have to prove. First, the transition from old to new system indeed diminishes trust. There must be some evidence that this is actually happened. And the second stage would be that once the trust diminished, that there are more vulnerabilities and indeed more populist attacks. So for that, you can use more like, if it's not in your intention to come up with like an empirical model to measure all this, but you can just grab or borrow some like empirical literature on trusting judges, examples of countries where reforms that intended more regulation actually backfired, or cross-national comparisons, or compare the before and after in one country, whether like this, you know, after the imposition of more rules, there was an actual change, or use any other metrics such as, you know, that survey public opinion. So in conclusion, it's like, I really appreciate like the effort that including trust. I think that is a very relevant aspect. And I think that by making like more like adjustments in your text, you are very close to come with like a natural contribution on this topic. So congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Hold on.
Sure.
We'll listen to Erin's comments.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Luis. I co-sign Luis's commentary. Maybe I could just stop there, but I want to add a couple of additional things. Luis's first point, though, is one of my points, so I won't go into that, which is just how he described the scope conditions, whether you're building theory or creating a narrative of the UK. I would encourage you to focus on the UK, because I think you run into a lot of problems as soon as you get out and away from a system where you have that cultural, and we're going to talk about the word trust, but that cultural commitment to the judiciary. And so I was thinking about, you know, post-war Germany, or what happened in the French Revolution to the judges. And so it just felt like you were going to struggle as a global theory. So I just want to say that again, that I agree with that. But my comments are more about sort of the way in which you're seeking to turn the conventional wisdom of judicial independence on its head by saying all this regulatory aspects of judicial independence is problematic. And when I first read it, like, I have to say, I was irritated. I was like, what, what are you talking about? Like, come on. And my comments are sort of irritated, but as I listen to you, I'm now not irritated at all. And I think you're absolutely right, but for totally different reasons. So I am now full on board with this project, having really run the entire emotional gamut on my feelings about it. So let me tell you where I was struggling, and then let me tell you about why I think you're exactly right, but for different reasons.
Okay.
Okay, so I was struggling because my first question is trust the right way of thinking about judicial independence and judging? Do we trust judges? Does A rely on B to do C? Who is A? B we know is the judge. And what is C? So is it we're relying on judges to make the right decision? What if they don't? We're relying on judges. Are we relying on the adversarial process in the UK, which is quite distinct from a judge, right? Do we feel, and you think of the protections of the adversarial process as quite different? What about the role of the jury relevant in the UK? Again, I'm just keeping it to the UK. Legal structure system writ large. Are we respecting their ability to have the final say as the judge? But is that the same thing as trusting them? So one question is, well, what's a metric of this? Luis's question. Well, accepting the outcome would be a metric. All right, we accept the outcome. But does the acceptance of a judicial outcome provide any evidence or insight into trust? How would we know that trust is doing the work? So there's a lot of political science work on this, right? That actually people are motivated reasoners. They believe their side of the case is right. They aren't trusting the judge to get the right answer. They're maybe trusting a process, but even when they get the answer that is opposing them, they don't believe, oh, I was wrong. I brought this case and I was wrong. No one kind of has this sort of moment of realization. I never should have, invested that time, energy, and money in bringing this claim. They think the judge has got it wrong, but they are compliant because they are contingent compliers, recognizing that they've bought into the system. And so long as other people comply when the decision goes against them, they comply. So the concept of contingent compliance and human nature as being motivated reasoners seems to be doing, or at least there's a lot of evidence that that's doing the work of what you call trust. So we could say something like there's a cultural confidence in the system, or a cultural acceptance that judges are not going to go against the same group of people over and over and over in order to break that concept of contingent compliance, because that's where it breaks down. So in the United States, there's examples of, courts that consistently rule against Black parties losing the confidence of Black litigants because it doesn't feel like a dynamic of contingent compliance, it feels biased. So maybe you're in a world where you could say culturally, we don't have that here. We did not have that here in the UK. You'd have to show some of that. So then the question is, how can you show that, or can you show that? So if we think, assuming that somewhere between trust and cultural confidence is the right definition, and I do worry that you have to break that simple trust model apart in a really big way to figure out what that C is. What are we trusting? I kind of want to go back to A now. Who is doing the trusting, right? So this golden age of trusting in judges, starting in 1701, we get the 1701 regulatory response because people did not trust judges. Star Chamber was a disaster, right? So you're coming out of this period of time And Emily Cadence writes about this in an article actually called Cheating Pays, but about sort of going to all the different courts at that time. You go to the common law courts, you go to the equity courts, you know, you've got Star Chamber, you've got the Court of Chancery, you're playing off judges precisely because it was a forum shopping occasion, which does not suggest a lot of trust in either the judge or the judiciary. It strikes me as sort of typical legal manipulation. Okay, but so you get the regulatory response to the break of trust. Do we then see between 1701 and, let us say, 1950, a culture of trust that emerges? If so, who is that for? You use my favorite, right? The old good chap, right? It makes me a little worried, right? Are they chaps? Who are they? Are they white chaps? Are they wealthy white chaps? How does the rigid class system and lack of social mobility in the 19th century translate to our understanding of trust in the judiciary? When you think about, you know, I don't know much about the 19th century judiciary, but I've read Bleak House. Like, that is not a hugely successful description of judicial trust, right? And I did a little research, 1853, it like broke every record in terms of who was reading it and how. So maybe people trusted, or maybe the judges were just as much of punching bags at that time, but in a different way. So even accepting all of that, right? Okay, there was this historic era of trust in judges. The A to B to C is filling and I loved you said this is what like revolutionized, this is why I love the project, right? You feel like I'm being negative, but I'm coming back around, right? You said there's a judge-shaped hole that we all have in our minds. This is core to the feminist literature, right? The judge-shaped hole we have in our minds is a white man. That's the hole. And so then I started thinking, dude, what starts happening in the 1970s? Women start, maybe not exactly, but almost getting appointed as judges. The Windrush generation comes in. It's not just population growth. It's a massive multicultural shift within the UK. And there's pressure for judicial diversity. And then I started thinking, what else happened in the CRA? 2005, you get for the first time the Judicial Commission thumb on the scale for diversity. So now I'm thinking, no, all of this push towards the regulatory construction is because at bottom, we don't believe that non-white men are judicially independent. And our anxiety about bias and our anxiety about, you know, regulating people is actually because the profession of judges no longer looks like that cozy old cultural profession that you've identified. But instead of saying, oh, but look at, isn't all this regulation good? It's actually necessary because we don't trust who's coming on the bench. And so I hadn't thought of it that way. I had been thinking of it as, oh, thinking about Germany, thinking about France, thinking about emerging countries, and we need all this. But from the perspective of the UK, which is what you're introducing here, why would we need that suddenly in 2005? Why suddenly would we need to change this effective approach to judicial independence, this cozy cultural trust or compliance or competence? Well, we would need to change it because how do we know you're not biased? Because if the baseline judge is a white male, if you're judging my case and you're not that, you're bringing in your cognitive biases against me. So we better regulate you and feel confident that you're doing that. And there's a lot of good literature. There's some fantastic artwork by a woman at the Slade, Carrie Young, who does work on how women judges wear robes and wigs. And there's also very interesting writing about the way in which diversity in the profession has also given rise to these complaints about bias. And certainly in the United States, right? You hear Donald Trump saying words about judges of Hispanic origin, women judges, anyone that isn't a white male judge as having an inherent bias. There are also biases he claims against white male judges who disagree with him politically, but the sort of inherent primordial tie kind of bias that seems to be being addressed through the regulatory system says something about that whole. So I am now, you see me, I've gone all the way around, but I'm like, yeah, actually, maybe you are 100% right, but it's not as much for the professionalism angle that you've taken as it is for what's distinct about judges and what's different and what makes it impossible to go back to that cozy community that existed before.
Well, thank you. That's a lot to think about there.
Well, we started with a disenchantment, but it's been enchanting. We'll give you a few minutes to respond to all those.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think I can hope to respond to both of your comments in detail, but thank you very much for them. There's a lot to think about. Louisa, I think you've pointed out lots of things that I agree with, essentially. It's tricky because there obviously is a significant empirical dimension to this, and in another version of this paper, I thought about advancing trust as an empirical dimension of authority, actually. But there's so all I can say is yes, okay. I am to some extent in a polemical rather than empirical space at this stage of the work. So in that sense, I suppose I think it's okay for that. It's certainly for a broader project, it needs more empirical measures. Although I would say also that in a lot of the empirical literature, the political science literature, social theory literature, there's a lot of dispute about what trust surveys, for example, are measuring. A lot of people who study this say, well, actually, the trust survey, people are not responding trust. That's not how they actually feel. So that's really different. But I think, broadly speaking, there's nothing I can disagree with in any of that, and I just say I will incorporate it. I'll run with it, and I'll beg, borrow, and steal your thoughts on that. So thank you, Erin. There's a lot to do with diversity. There's a lot happening in diversity around 2005. And of course, one of the big changes that happens post 2005 with the Judicial Appointments Commission is actually diversity appointments goes down. So we get the centrality of merit. And if you speak to female judges now, they grab merit as an absolute central principle. When in roughly 2013, diversity was included as a potential tiebreaker, a lot of judges were against that. A lot of female judges were against that because they didn't want to feel like they were second rate. And if you compare that with other jurisdictions, the one I'm most familiar with, Ireland, people who have done research with Irish female judges say that those judges are quite happy to say, I think I was probably picked because I was female and they want to balance it up, because the bench here have latched onto merit as this absolute, in some ways, the exclusion of all. So I think that there's definitely something there, and I'm going to have to go away and think about how that something connects to what else I've said. So yeah, and I like my narrative of professionalism, and I am minded to defend it simply because the similarities with what's happening in other professions are so clear. The parallels are so clear, but that doesn't mean that there aren't also other drivers. So I suppose that's my way of saying I'm going to have to go away and think about how that incorporates and how that influences perhaps not this specifically, but the broader project. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.